Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week, in our second session covering Katharine Kerr's Celtic fantasy Daggerspell, we return first to the present and then head back to the past to see the first and most direct consequence of Garion's calamitous series of choices. And we learn that the knots of debt and destiny are not so easily undone. Before we get to that, though, well, I want to rewind to last week's show and pick up a thread that I didn't have time to follow. And it's a thread which I think works better even in this week's discussion, now that we've had this new incarnation of Geraint and Cullen, Tannic. As you might guess from the somewhat hesitant introduction, this is going to be a more difficult topic than I usually tackle on this podcast, so content warnings definitely apply for questions of consent and incest. The social taboo against incest is one of the oldest and deepest that we have. It is, to a greater or lesser degree, universal. Every community and culture on Earth has a taboo against romantic and sexual relationships between people who are closely related. Where we draw those lines might change from place to place and from time to time, but if you make a list of the most basic rules of human society, don't have sex with members of your own family ranks pretty high. But at the same time, it is a common feature of mythology and folklore, also from almost every culture. Greek and Roman mythology are, frankly, replete with examples. Egyptian mythology, Norse mythology, Icelandic, British, including some versions of the story of King Arthur. Many, many versions of the flood myth end with a brother and sister repopulating the world from scratch. And so on, and so on. So why, if the incest taboo is so powerful, do we tell so many stories in which it's broken? This comes from Patricia Monaghan in the Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology and Folklore. Quote, "It has been argued that incest motifs hide myths of origin, for in the beginning of time, incest would have been the only way to populate the globe. Such incestuous unions are often used to argue the original divinity of figures that have been diminished or euhemerized into human form." End quote. Euhemerized there, by the way, is a great word derived from Euhemerus, a 4th century BCE philosopher, writer, and collector of myths, who argued that the mythic age of any culture is an exaggerated version of real history. That is, at some point in the distant past, there was a real king named Zeus, and maybe he lived at the top of a big hill, and maybe he had a lightning bolt on his banners, and maybe there were rumors about his many and varied sexual escapades. Over time, so Euhemerus tells us, these stories get inflated until Zeus is the king of the gods atop Mount Olympus. But we, as smart, literate, insightful, modern, circa the 4th century BCE readers, should understand that Zeus was of course not a god, just a petty king of a minor kingdom somewhere nearby. How then do storytellers and poets and, perhaps most importantly, priests, preserve the magnitude of the mythology? How do they resist this process of euhemerization? Well, they give the mythological figures qualities which are impossible to reduce, impossible to euhemerize. They include details within the myth that make it impossible for the audience to believe that great Zeus was actually just a dude. And as Monaghan argues, what better way of absolutely and definitively removing someone from the category of human being than by attributing to them the crossing of our most fundamental social lines? If our heroes of myth and legend commit incestuous acts, if they cross one of the first and most universal and most consistent and most important lines that we as a society collectively draw, then we can be sure that they aren't like us. They are irreducible. They are impossible to euhemerize. And I think that there is something to this interpretation, but I also think that it is incomplete, partly because it would presumably follow that incest as a narratological maneuver, as a strategy to preserve the divinity or otherworldliness of our characters, would therefore be exclusive to stories about people who are not human, and that's demonstrably untrue. The truth, and I do think that this is additive to the ideas laid out by Monaghan, I would note, the truth is that romantic or sexual relationships which are themselves transgressive can sometimes be attractive to us when presented in a fictional frame. Consider this. A standard, typical, socially acceptable romance in which all the various standards of behavior are met. Two single adults meet by accident. They like each other. They perform the various social rituals of dating and of increasing intimacy over an acceptable period of time. They are emotionally and socially and culturally and sexually compatible. And then they seal that compatibility with whatever oaths of monogamous fidelity are appropriate to their shared culture. This is good. This is healthy. This is what makes for a stable society where everyone behaves themselves. And we're folding in here, too, all of those stabilizing forces, right? All of the inescapable notions of compulsory heterosexuality, compulsory heteroromanticism, compulsory monogamy, and so on. Be well behaved, love appropriately, have sex appropriately, have children and raise them appropriately, and the status quo shall be preserved. Society itself will be stable. But we don't just tell stories about these orthodox, well-ordered romances. We tell stories, and have always told stories, about loves and desires which transgress. Enemies to lovers stories, for example, in which our understanding of what attraction looks like is challenged. Stories where a wealthy person falls in love with a poor person, challenging our understanding of social boundaries and of a safely limited social mobility. Stories of adulterous desire, like Lancelot and Guinevere. We tell stories where heroes fall in love with villains, where humans fall for fairies and for monsters, where the slayer hooks up with vampires on a semi-regular basis. We tell stories about love affairs which are epic and disastrous and glorious and ruinous. There is, narratologically, something of value, something that we find rewarding in these stories of excessive and transgressive love. Sometimes that can be titillating or dramatic or tragic. There's a whole spectrum of transgressive romance and erotica, from things which almost everyone would be okay with to very extreme things which almost no one would be okay with. And if you're going to transgress, if we accept that transgressive love stories have a value in our culture, well, the incest taboo is probably the biggest line that you can cross. So let's skip back to last week's reading and look specifically at the relationship between Geraint and Brangwen as it's presented to us. Geraint has harbored incestuous, explicitly sexual and romantic feelings for his sister for an unknown period of time, but certainly since prior to the beginning of the book. He considers himself, as we discussed briefly last week, cursed. Despite this self-awareness, he continually isolates Brangwen and keeps her for himself. This culminates when they ride out together to the Meadowlands, to, in fact, the stream which demarcated the limits of their freedom as children, right? The point past which they were not allowed to go. That is where they are, on that demarcating line between childhood and adulthood, when Geraint finally succumbs to his desire. Brangwen looks for daisies, the symbol in Devery, we're told, of first loves, and Geraint, still pretending that he is thinking of Brangwen's worth as a future wife, asks whether or not she is a virgin, and when she says that she is, he kisses her. The strategy here seems to be to communicate both the intensity and the excess of his desire. So powerful is his love that it cannot be constrained, not even by the most fundamental taboos of our society. He immediately tells Brangwen to leave so that he can kill himself, another powerful taboo, by the way, but she refuses, offering herself up to him, believing explicitly that they will both die immediately after having sex. It's Geraint who decides that he wants more, again making the jealous, selfish choice, and that they will have instead the summer. It is bad news, but it is anchored in the enormity of these feelings. Their incestuous relationship, then, does two things. On the one hand, it does, per Monaghan, I think, render them in mythical terms, as archetypes of obsessive, wounded, desperate, passionate love. Cursed. Indeed, there's an unresolved question as to whether Geraint's desire for Brangwen is the product of the priest's curse on the Falcon clan. On the other hand, it elevates the intensity of their love for one another, which is not to suggest that their love is of the same type, but that it is, I think, of a similar magnitude. Geraint's is twisted and obsessive and desirous and jealous, and seems to be primarily sexual, primarily about possession and ownership. In both its fundamental form and in its intensity, we would consider it bad. That is, even if Brangwen were not Geraint's sister, we probably still wouldn't be cool with the way that he feels about her. Brangwen, by contrast, seems to love in an appropriately sisterly way, with concern and with care and with an attention to his moods and needs. But the magnitude of that love, again, fueled here by grief and fear and despair, the magnitude of this love is exaggerated to such a point that she willingly offers herself to her brother to prevent him from killing himself. So while in the first instance we might think that the nature of her love for him is admirable, is right, she clearly carries it far too far. This is not emphatically to suggest that they are equally culpable for what happens. Geraint has consciously orchestrated this entire scenario. Brangwen, in her grief, is caught up in it. And behind this story, of course, behind this specific tale, there is the fundamental thematic conflict of the book as a whole. Self-awareness and wisdom and weird. Can we set aside our immediate desires? Can we recognize those which are unhealthy and take wise action? That's the test. And we'll see how that plays out for both of them in incarnations to come. But to wrap up these thoughts, there's one further complication, I think, which is anchored in where we join and where we leave this ongoing story. Because presumably, Brangwen is not the first incarnation of this soul, just the first that we are given. Although, I should note that in The Silver Mage, the 15th book of the Devery cycle published in 2009, we get the only flashback in the series which predates Brangwen and Gowrian. We discover that our core characters, in fact, have been orbiting each other for 500 years before Nevin makes his rash oath. The point is, though, that Brangwen and Geraint will be seen again in multiple lives, in multiple incarnations, including 2 more in this very book, and none of them will be brother and sister. Cullen and Jill are the closest, and as I've suggested, that relationship puts a very different emphasis on their shared history, though I should note that with Geraint inheriting leadership of the clan after the death of their father, his relationship with Brangwen is also coloured by an explicitly patriarchal authority. In any case, we can see that being brother and sister is not an inherent, innate part of their dynamic. In other lives and other relationships, this desire is still possessive and defiant, as we will see from Tannic in this week's reading. And if Geraint's desire is to possess Brangwen, as seems to be the case, then perhaps there is an ironic complexity to their sibling relationship, making him both the least likely person to try to own and control her, but also the person with the best possible opportunity to do so. And underlying all of this is, of course, the topic that we're going to come back to next week at the end of this novel. For all the emphasis which is put in this book on weird, on the choices that we make to accept it or to fight it or to flee from it, does this book present a clear perspective on what is considered good, moral, or immoral? Come to that. Are there universal virtues in the world of Devery? Are certain behaviors always considered right or wrong, regardless of one's personal weird? And if so, what are they? What can we shake loose from the moral framework that's presented to us in this book? We'll return to that thought next week when we have, well, a lot more to discuss. We'll pick up then with this week's reading, and we'll begin in Devery 1058. Jill is now 13 and has been riding with her father for 6 years, and we can see, even on the first page of this chapter, how much she has been changed by the experience, and how much she hasn't. While combing her hair, she tells her gnome that, quote, "Stupid town lasses primp all the time, but I'm a silver dagger's daughter," end quote. We see how important that identity is to her as Cullen asks her what she would like for her birthday. No lace, no dresses, no doll. So instead, they go to see Otho the blacksmith, who Nevin will confirm within the next few pages is actually a dwarf. And we have neither the time nor, frankly, the excuse to go too deeply into it here. But yes, there are dwarves within the Devery cycle, taken from the Norse tradition into the Celtic, and generally very familiar to any reader of contemporary fantasy. They don't play a large part in this particular novel, but they do recur later in the series. Here, it's revealed that Cullen was teasing Jill and that he wants her to have, well, he wants her to have her own silver dagger. This is obviously extremely loaded, and we might well be reminded of Geraint consistently choosing to keep Brangwen with him rather than letting her go off in her own life. And this is all the more dubious, given that the life of the silver dagger is so dangerous rather than the comfort of the dun of the falcon. This choice, which pleases Jill so much in the moment, is part of a very nicely orchestrated, if profoundly disquieting, 3-beat spread throughout this section. Jill opens the chapter bathing quickly because she doesn't like Cullen seeing her without clothes on these days. Then we get the giving of the silver dagger, the giving of jewelry, the binding of Jill to Cullen's own way of life. Then, at the tavern after the boys have been flirting with her, Cullen reasserts himself, and she feels uncomfortable with the way that he is looking at her. This is the reward, I think, of the book's structural strategy. Like Nevin, we are cursed with knowledge. We can see the repetition of the same patterns, life after life. Otho, though, knows Jill for who she is, and he gives this cryptic riddle: if she ever finds no one, she should ask him what craft to take. And conveniently, who else should show up in Dunmanannan that fall, a half year after Jill's scene in the early spring, than Nevin himself? We begin to put the pieces of the story together, and Nevin goes off to check on Rodri Mailwaith, the reincarnation of Blaine of the Boar, who he finds sick with a fever. And I'm going to offer a short spoiler here just because I find it genuinely lovely. When Rodri is caught in his fever, he asks after someone named Owain, and Nevin remembers a previous life in which he tended this same soul in a different body. And we don't get that story in this book, but we do get it in the third book in the series, The Bristling Wood, published in the UK as Dawnspell, in which Mathen, a reincarnation of Blaine, serves as co-commander of the Silver Daggers alongside Owain, a reincarnation of Geraint. It's pretty good, you guys. It's pretty good. We conclude this very short chapter with Nevin being recognized by Lothian, now the mother of Rodri, just as she had been Rotha, the mother of Blaine, and then not just recognized as a familiar soul, but as a Dwemer master. Quote, "My apologies, my lady, for startling you." "No apology needed, my lord." Lothian pronounced the honorific slowly and deliberately. "I'm most honoured that a man like you would stoop to treating my son for a fever." "I see that my lady doesn't dismiss tales of Dwemer as nonsense fit only to amuse children." "Her ladyship has seen too many odd things in her life to do anything of the sort." End quote. Lothian agrees to take Nevin with her, allowing him to keep an eye on Rodri. And now there's something interesting happening here, I think, in terms of the Dwemer, in terms of who knows about it and how that secret is protected. Lothian has seen enough to know that there is magic in the world, but rather than using her position to challenge the common perception of such things as fantasy first and witchcraft second, she instead keeps the information to herself. Now, on the one hand, we might forgive her for not challenging the way that her society understands magic, but on the other, the product of that reticence, the consequence of that reticence, is the preservation of special knowledge, of special power in the hands of the social elite, the nobility, aligning the dominant social force with the practitioners of magic. It isn't clear what would happen if Nevin in public, in Aberwyn or in Dundevry, demonstrated the Dwemer and convinced the common population that magic has been real this whole time, you guys. Perhaps it would be dangerous. Perhaps the social upheaval would be destructive. But it sure feels like we're restricting knowledge and power to those already in positions of power, doesn't it? And this isn't so much a criticism of Kerr as it is kind of an open question about the political underpinnings of contemporary fantasy and what we hold to be power in these worlds. From there, we move into Chapter 4, and the formal structure of this book, as I've noted before, is wild. We return here to the past, to Devery 696, 55 years after the death of Brangwyn and the swearing of Nevin's oath. Here we get the first epigraph from the edicts of King Bran, who led the original Deverians to this land and established the kingdom. Quote, "And the bard is picked out by his Agwyn, not only to delight his lord, but to remember all the great deeds and great men in his clan, all in their proper order. For if men were without knowledge of anything but the name of each man's father, then the children of bondsmen would be as noble or as base as the children of a Gwerbert. Therefore let no man nor woman either commit the impiety of raising a hand against a bard." End quote. So, two things, each extremely important. Bards and Agwyn. The role of the medieval bard, which Kerr is borrowing pretty directly here, is that of an historian, a repository of lore and law, a teller of tales and an entertainer, yes, but also a keeper of the lines of genealogy, distributors of news. It is a strictly oral tradition, particularly in Devery, because Kerr adds that neat little twist that if a bard learns to read, he loses his connection to his Agwyn. And that possessive adjective, by the way, his Agwyn, is used consistently throughout and is fascinating. Agwyn, taken in the abstract, is a patron of bards, a goddess that connects the bard to what seems to be a magical tradition. But unlike other gods in Devery, the relationship between a bard and his Agwyn is specific, it is personal, it is unique. It is also strangely intimate. And you know, there's something fascinating happening with the politics too in this epigraph. King Bran adopts the declamatory posture in the first part of the excerpt, and the bard is picked out by his Agwyn, which presents the idea that this is part of the natural order of things. For lo, the bard shall be picked out by his Agwyn. This is comprehension, this is understanding, this is the way of things. Bards are special, they have a special connection. But the purpose to which that special connection is put is the confirmation of the standing social order. This isn't completely distinct from what I was just saying about Lothian in the previous chapter. In both cases, special knowledge or power is set to the service of the existing social hierarchy in Devery. Bards exist so that they can tell everyone who is noble and who is not, because otherwise, chaos. King Bran is crediting that desire, that political utility, to Agwin, which might be presumptuous, which might be cynical, or which might, given the constructed nature of this world, might actually be true. And we should always remember that in a world in which your birth is a part of your destiny, a starting point from which you can achieve that weird, then we ought not, perhaps, to be critical of the feudal structure which exists, which I suppose begs the question, is Devery such a world? Well, we'll continue to look at that as we move forward. So we open this chapter in Blaithbeer, in Dunblaith, in fact, the seat of the White Wolf clan, led by Lord Marowik. We introduce the drought and the possibility that a curse lays over the land, but we're really introducing Gwerin and his wife Lyssa, the reincarnations of Blaine, who always wanted to be a bard in his previous life, as you might remember, and Brangwen, no longer the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, but possessed, interestingly, of the most beautiful voice, a voice for which she has little to no use. They have 2 sons, and life seems pretty good, all things considered. Gwerin, trying to get to the root of the drought, and at the urging of the priest of Bel, with whom he has an amusingly fractious relationship, I think, conducts the ritual, the opening of the well, to commune with his Agwin and delve into the past. He begins with a song that she gave him. Quote, "I was a flame flaring in the fire. I was a hare hiding in the briar. I was a drop running with the rain. I was a scythe slicing the grain. Axe and tree, ship and sea, naught that lives is strange to me. I was a beggar pleading a meal. I was a Dwemer sword of steel." It's an interesting, though perhaps not very sophisticated piece of poetry. The flame flaring in the fire might well remind us of the Hall of Light from the prologue, where everything is light within light, and even the words of the Great Ones are sparks. The rabbit in the briar, shifting into an animalistic mode here, is vulnerable, yes, hiding from hunters or predators, but crucially is behaving as rabbits do, is exemplifying a kind of harmony, the thing as it was intended to be. The drop in the rain returns us to the notion of fire, but slipping into another element connects us to the plains, to the wildfolk, to the Dwemer. But then we have the scythe. We have the tool being wielded by someone else. The grain, too, I suppose, is suggestive of farms and of agriculture, but the scythe is definitive of them. It is a different kind of metaphor, which prepares us for what we might take following the shift in rhythm to be a chorus of the song. Axe and tree, ship and sea. Again, these are metaphors dependent on constructed objects, on tools of a sort, but also inviting ideas of dominance and mastery in the absence of active verbs. Axe and tree? Well, I know who's winning that one. I know what that relationship is. Ship and sea is a touch more ambiguous, of course, and the dominance there is more collaborative, perhaps, but it is still the exercise of a constructed artifact over the natural world. You'll note, too, that tense shift. I was a flame, a hare, is contrasted with naught that lives is strange to me. Suddenly we're in the present tense. We had these lives before, which may very well be significant, but here, nothing that lives is strange. Then, in the fragment of what I take to be the second stanza, the beggar pleading the meal lifts us again, pointing us toward perhaps society, community, particular individual insufficiency, yes, but also the capacity for generosity and altruism. And then, perhaps, the most perplexing line, the Dwemer sword of steel. Presumably, this is an enchanted sword? Is this representative of bardic knowledge in this time and place? Is this the enfolding of the stories that Gwerin knows, the mythology of Devery, into his conceptualization of everything, of naught that lives is strange to me, including the stories of great heroes and times of lore that I can relate to you? His Agwin, after some praise and much flattery, tells him that there was a murder, but that it has already been avenged. He then sees Blaine, who tells him that his brother avenged his death, as we saw at the end of the previous flashback, the vision which caused Brangwen to throw herself into the river. This vision concludes with a soft mist and the voice of his Agwin warning him once again that Blaine was avenged. So that's probably the end of that story, right? We emerge from the vision and return to the real world to be introduced to the reincarnation of Isola, who is now called Katha, and Geraint himself, now called Tannic, who has been nicknamed the Falcon, and who, it is quickly revealed, isn't actually interested in Katha romantically, but rather in Lyssa. So we see the same psychodrama playing out. Tannic wants Lyssa, just as Geraint wanted Brangwen. Katha is all but ignored, just as Isola was, and Gwerin is in a dangerous place, just like Blaine. Nevin shows up and immediately bumps into Katharine, recognizing her, and falls in with Adarin, the elder son of Gwerin and Lissa. A quick pronunciation note here. I'm assuming that Adarin's diminutive nickname is Addo, and that the double D formulation is not pronounced the same way as in formal names. That is to say, it is not Atho, but I could be wrong. I'm going to go with Addo on those rare occasions when he is called by that cute little nickname. Then, as Nevin sits by the river, we are suddenly handed, out of nowhere, a ton of world building. There are forces in this world which permeate and penetrate everything we can see. There are planes. Nevin creates within his imagination a 5-pointed star and then imbues it with energy so that it exists independently of him. It is a portal to the Wildlands, the etheric plane where the wild folk live. He sees that there's conflict there and asks to talk with their kings, then closes the portal and seals the magic with 3 slaps of the ground. 3, again, just as when the Lords of Weird sealed his oath to the dead Brangwyn. Quote, "I'll try again tomorrow night," Nevin thought. "If things are this bad, sooner or later the kings will accept my aid." Although man is meant to rule the wild folk, not worship or placate them, they deserve respect and due courtesy, which Nevin could offer them as one prince true born to another. End quote. So, wow, that's a lot to unpack in one short paragraph. Meant to rule is an awfully loaded phrase, and it isn't generally consistent, I think, with the relationship between human beings and the fairy folk, at least in myth and folklore beyond this book. To understand what's happening here, we need to clarify whose voice we're getting right now, which is perhaps a little easier for you guys hearing me quote that excerpt than it is for me reading it on the page. We only get one attributed thought at the beginning of the paragraph, but it seems as though the rest is in Nevin's voice too. I think we can be certain of that from that last line. Nevin can offer due respect and courtesy because he is even now a true-born prince, even though he has been stripped of his rank by the High King of Devery and his name taken too, though he has made his oath and sworn himself to the pursuit of weird and justice, he still sees himself as a nobleman. Furthermore, we've seen consistently throughout the novel that Jill and her gnome have a very special relationship, and Jill certainly isn't a true-born noble. She treats her gnome not with courtesy, with respect, but with a genuine kindness and affection. I mentioned in last week's episode that one of the things which distinguishes Kerr as a writer is her grasp of history and the ways in which societies change and evolve. And it seems to me that we're getting an example of that right here. Nevin has been a wandering herbman for 50 years, but his view of the world is still that of the ruling class. It's feudalistic political philosophy to say that, though a subject class ought to be ruled, they ought to be ruled with respect and courtesy. I think this perspective is confirmed a few pages later, after Nevin has his first confrontation with Tannic and realizes who he is. Quote, "He realized he had fallen into the last vestige of royal pride, which values only the prince and the princess, and sees those around them only as supernumeraries." End quote. So let's assume that perhaps the belief that man is meant to rule the wild folk is also a vestige of royal pride. This is demonstrated, I think, too, a little later, when Nevin realizes how the tangle of weird and obligation has manifested itself in this life. Lissa repaying the debt that Brangwyn owed Blaine, and caring for the child that Brangwyn took to the river with her. He's exhausted. He despairs, only for sylphs and sprites, wild folk of air and ether, to soothe him, infusing him with their energy. And we're told that that is, quote, "a gift between friends." No mention of ruling, no mention of mastery. It seems that though he has lived this life for 50 years, Nevin still has a long way to go. From there, the rains come, and we get the unfolding of Gwerin's plot against the impious Tannic, taunting him with songs of foiled adultery night after night, then singing about a falcon who is shot through the heart when he goes after a pretty bird. Tannic draws his sword on the unarmed bard, and is sentenced immediately to death by Merowick, the Lord of Blaithbeard. It is a tight, somewhat satisfying tragedy. It is a twisted little story of weird and of obligation both. And we get that coda there where Nevin goes to confront Gwerin, and we see the cost of his plan. Quote, "It's your weird, my friend, and truly you'll pay for this someday." Where? In the shadowy other lands. Gwerin smiled so smugly that Nevin felt like slapping him. Here, Gwerin had been given a chance to free himself from the tangled weird that he had shared with Geraint. He could have let the past slip and honorably used the laws to send his enemy far away from his woman. Instead, he'd used the law like a sword. End quote. Which, of course, raises an interesting question. Did Gwerin go too far? He certainly ignored the wisdom of his goddess, right? Or perhaps misunderstood the message in which she assured him early in the chapter that despite his personal feelings, his previous murder had already been avenged. But here, Blaine reincarnated seeks his own vengeance, at least in part, and so the cycle of violence and the tangle of weird continues. We see elements of that too in Katharine, with both Lissa and Nevin atoning in part for the consequences of their actions in that previous life. This idea that the knots of weird are not simple and that there are always unintended consequences that branch off from any action, that while it's important for a person to pursue their own personal weird, we can't help but be entangled in the stories of others. We conclude with Nevin taking Katharine as his apprentice and Lissa wishing that she had a little more power and a man's strength. Nevin warns her from making that kind of wish, but with a little shrug, Lissa went back to watching the view, as if she were seeing a distant future there. That story, which I've already pointed toward, is told too in the second book. And that, believe it or not, is where we set aside the formal structure of this novel. The rest of the book is in the present. It's unraveling a few outstanding threads from the beginning of the novel, but mostly focusing on an entirely new conflict, an entirely new plot. And this is, well, that's a strange choice. Partly because we're so prioritizing this part of the story. As I noted, Chapter 5 is almost half the novel, and the two embedded flashbacks don't quite balance the other half. What's strange, though, is that this present plot, the drama that we're about to be caught up in, doesn't really leverage the tensions created by the structure of the story, by the established framework. It will resolve some of them, yes, and will be haunted, shadowed by others, but it isn't about them. It's actually a much more traditional fantasy novel. There's just a dark wizard, you guys. It's a novella all its own that happens to operate as one of the embedded parts of this much more ambitious and much more unusual work. For all that, I think it's really quite good, and I'm looking forward to getting into it with you. And it's not to say I think that there's a complete thematic division between the series and the novel. The ongoing plot with Lothlane will certainly resonate with some of those same thematic ideas. So, let's get into it. We begin with the epigraph from the secret book of Cadwallon, the Druid. Quote, "The Dwemer is a vast wilderness crossed by a few safe roads. To either side of the road lies uncharted country filled with wild beasts, chasms and swamps, dangers that can slay the unwary soul as surely as a wild boar will slay the unwary hunter. Mock them not until you have faced them." End quote. So, at this point, the secret book is beginning to make a little more sense, because it is clearly not a generally accessible treatise on the Dwemer, but rather an instruction book for the apprentice, because most people, of course, will never face those dangers or even know that they exist. Apprentices, on the other hand, know just enough to be dangerous and must be warned away from the more dangerous parts of their craft. That makes a lot of sense and will be, of course, particularly applicable to the events in the rest of the book. We open the chapter proper with Jill, now 17, riding with her father in Eldith on the western edge of Devery. Cullen is aging, he is drinking more to cover the pain of a life spent on the road, and we see that he still has some, perhaps too much, of Geraint in him. Quote, "He'd never known or even heard of a silver dagger who had lasted as long as he had. And how much longer will it be before you face your weird?" he asked himself. "You got to find Jill a good man to take care of her." As usual, he shoved the thought away fast. He would deal with it later. End quote. Once again, this soul, now in a new and aging body, is jealous, is selfish, and wants to keep the woman that he loves with him. We then cut out to Rodri, now a man of 20, being called up in front of his mother, who now rules in her own right following the death of her husband, an unusual but not unprecedented circumstance in either Devery or in our own real medieval world. Rodri is called up in front of his mother to answer the charge of impregnating the soapmaker's daughter, Olwen, but really, we're here for the politics, for the discontent among Luvian's vassals at being ruled by a woman, about Rodri inheriting. We're told that Lord Corbin of Bruthlin is leading the pack with the aid of his counsellor Lothlane, and then conveniently, we cut out to Jill and the merchant Dregeth selling a sword to that same Lothlane, perfumed and violet-eyed and obviously evil from like the jump, for an inflated price. And there's a critique available here, I think, that Lothlane is somewhat queer-coded, and that there's a nasty streak of something like homophobia under the surface of this book, particularly in Rodri's later description of Lothlane as a, quote, mincing fop, end quote, who, quote, stinks of perfume, end quote. It's worth pointing out that queer characters are not well represented in the Devery cycle, and there's some actively negative representation, particularly in the second book, in which the only avowedly gay characters are the villains of the piece, playing into all kinds of tropes about the depraved homosexual. The first edition of the book was much worse, in fact, but Kerr at least made some changes in the 1994 re-release that took some of the edges off, although many readers are still very critical of the choices that she has made in that volume. We'll certainly get into that if we ever get to the second book, but for now, I think it is valid to read Lothlane as being presented as the dangerous other, and certainly his appearance, his perfume, which will be somewhat justified later, and his manner are at least poorly conceived and, at the worst, borderline homophobic. Back to the plot. Cullen and the caravan are moving further into the west on their way to meet the aptly named Westfolk, and the Westfolk turn out to be, as we might have anticipated, elves, sir. Quote, they were tall, but slender, with deep-set eyes and moonbeam-pale hair like Lothlane's. Their faces would have been handsome if it weren't for their ears, which rose to a delicate point like the curled tip of a seashell. And then we get a paragraph later, quote, when she was close enough to notice their eyes, she was in for another shock. Their irises were enormous, with barely any white showing around them, and their pupils were a vertical slit like a cat's. They don't do that when their children are babies, Jill thought. I wonder how Dragath explains that away. End quote. So these are the elves of Kerr's world, Annwn, and what is interesting is that they aren't exactly what we might have been expecting. What becomes clear almost immediately is that these elves, the Westfolk, also exist in linear time, just as every other element of Devery does. We begin to understand that just prior to the meeting that I just described with some elven architecture. Quote, finally, some 4 hours after noon, they came to a river, churning white in a deep gorge. Over it in a graceful arch was a stone bridge, as well made as any in Devery. The side rails were carved in a looping pattern of leaves and vines, and here and there in rondelles were chiseled marks that had to be letters in some utterly alien alphabet. As the caravan clattered over the bridge, Jill studied the carvings. Here and there, as a decoration, the face of one of the wild folk peered out through the cluster of stone leaves. End quote. Looping patterns of leaves and vines, elegance, an alien alphabet, a mastery of craft and form, a synthesis of function and beauty. Now, this is the work of some Tolkien-style elves. The Westfolk, when we meet them, present at first some familiar aspects. It's only when they descend en masse that we realize that things are different. These people are nomadic. They're traveling in large groups, and they're setting up brightly colored tents, populated by bustle and activity and agency, and perhaps most importantly, children. That is surprising, not just because it distinguishes the Westfolk from earlier takes on the fantasy elf. This is around the time that we can begin to feel the influence of Dungeons and Dragons entering the frame here, as the Westfolk are an example of normalization as a species of beings in the world. But the presence of this gaudy domestic environment also pushes back against our notions of fairy, the land into which the tribe of King Bran entered back in the Dawn time. I mentioned earlier that the core plot of this book all but abandons the underlying structural concept of the series, but I will say that the reveal of Adoran here is quite lovely. Nevin's apprentice, Lissa's son with Gwennon, now coming face to face with the reincarnation of his mother in a most unexpected place. By contrast, when we cut back to Duncanabane and the Rodri storyline, we lose any of that tension, and I find it very surprising, frankly, that the character of Rhys, as important as he is as a means of applying leverage to Rodri, isn't a character established in one of the earlier time periods. Particularly because, for all of his friction with Rodri, he's a fairly well-drawn and interesting character, right? He is capable but proud. He is principled but also quick to anger. His brief negotiation with his mother about the setting aside of his wife so that he can have children and secure his dynasty is really rather touching, for all the stark realpolitik of it all. It's all the more interesting when coupled with Rodri's analysis of his motives regarding the rebellion and Rhys's increasingly obvious hope that Rodri will be killed in battle. Heading to Canabane to take Lothlane into custody for murder, Adoran fills Jill in on the history of the region. 800 years ago, the Deverians had pushed the Westfolk out of Eldith and claimed it as their own, echoing, of course, the conquest of Gaul by the Romans that drove the Deverians to this land in the first place. Actions have consequences. Cycles of violence will be perpetuated until they are forcibly and consciously broken. Shortly thereafter, Jill and Adoran determine that their party is about to be attacked by a well-armed foe. Cullen and the others take shelter in the ruins of an old fort, while Jill rides alone to Canabane to beg for assistance. We're also making a really important narratological maneuver here, revealing not just the presence of Dwemer to Cullen, but a sense of its scope and power. He's already tacitly acknowledged that magic is real, but when Adoran turns into an owl to scout the enemy position, he pushes back against it, refusing to accept that direct connection, turning instead to mail armor and the upcoming battle and all the things that he can rely upon. In another book, this is a cute character beat. In this book, with the emphasis put on self-awareness and awareness of the world, it might give us pause about whether or not Cullen's weird is as simple as dying in a brawl, or if there was something greater intended for this man. It might certainly also lead us to question whether or not he is living with sufficient wisdom. Speaking, though, of destiny, Rodri just so happens to be leading his warband out on exercise, choosing at random to travel west into the ambush. We get a little Shakespearean twist of mistaken identity, as in Rodri's POV he identifies Jill as a boy, and then we're into the fight. And here we get to see Kerr really delivering on the low fantasy reality of warfare. No heroics, no daring last-minute gambits, no massed charge of 500-man cavalry units. Instead, a total of 45 men, a test of will against the grinding erosion of lives. Albaral of the Westfolk falls in the last action, and Cullen realizes, rather touchingly, that he has made a friend after all, forcing him from his comfort zone and bringing him some much-needed character growth. And of course, Cullen also recognizes the young Cadvradok of the warband, Rodri Melwaith. We get the movement of the plot and the various warbands, but return to the ruined fort in time for Rodri and Jill to properly meet, which they kind of do, except that they don't say a word to each other, and the whole scene is oriented around Cullen in what I find to be a really interesting way. The following day, returning to our world building, we get the discussion between Calendarial and Jill following the burial of Albaral's body. Calendarial tells Jill that her silver dagger is dwarven silver, and puts the pieces together for her about Otho. And then it's revealed that the dagger glows in the presence of elves because the dwarves don't trust them. And of course it's hard to think of this, of dwarven silver, of mithril, of glowing blades, of enmity between the people of the forest and the people of the mountains without thinking of Tolkien. But Otho's specific distrust of Westfolk is also clearly folding in another tradition here. The nomadic lifestyle, the distrust of settled peoples, the beauty and the romance of the language and customs, the fierce independence, the elves of this world are clearly, I think, representative of, or modeled on, perhaps, the real world Romani. This is a take that I haven't seen before, and I really think it's a strong one. The last twist here is that Jill recognizes the Westfolk's true nature, elves, sir, by the story that Calendarial tells her. Quote, Calendarial smiled, taking any insult from his words. Now I've heard some of the tales you folk tell about us. We're not thieves, we're not demons from hell or closer to the gods than you are either, but simple flesh and blood like you. Old Adarin tells me that our gods fashioned us from the wild folk, just like your gods fashioned you from animals, so here we are, together on the earth for good or ill. Here, our priests say the god made us from earth and water. The Dwemer knows a fair bit more than priests. Remember that well. May I have the borrowing of that dagger again? I've got a wretched lot of work to do. Jill handed it back. For a long time she sat and watched it glow like fire in his hands, while she wondered over the strange things he told her. End quote. So again, the elves are distrusted by the dwarves, and it's very tempting, given this account of the creation of the races of men and elves, to speculate whether the dwarves of Annwn are created in a similar way to the dwarven forefathers of Tolkien's Legendarium, if they are crafted from the stone and the simulacrum of the younger races by Aule and imbued with life by Iluvatar. This is possibly coherent with Jill's account that the priests of Devery tell a slightly different origin story, setting men apart from other animals and installing instead a singularly divine origin. The dwarves aside, though, I think this is a very elegant way of drawing the distinction between elves and men, that is, though they share common characteristics and certainly share the same earth, their roots are completely different, one anchored in the realm of fairy and the other in the mundane. Nevin communicates with Adarin from the field, and Adarin admits that he was the one who trained Lothlane, though he doesn't think that Lothlane has taken up the dark path, rather that he's, quote, merely insane, end quote. And maybe it's just the mention of the dark path, but, you know, I've got a bad feeling about this. Quote, Lothlane had never had iron in his soul, only the malleable silver of a raw psychic talent that should have been suppressed, not encouraged. At least, if Adarin was right, Lothlane was only misusing his Dwemer, not immersing himself in strange and unclean things. Just as every light casts a shadow, so does a dark Dwemer exist. End quote. We get further confirmation of this a little later after we've had some nice character work and Jill has demonstrated her martial skill to Rodri's warband. In an unexpected move, we cut suddenly to Lothlane and get an extended account of his experience with the dark. Quote, many visions came to him unbidden these days, just odd little things, voices half heard, things half seen, and always he could understand the cause, but still they were terrifying, because he knew that they should never have come at all. A Dwemerman works long years to open his mind to the innerlands, but at the same time as to close his mind at will, to draw a veil between himself and unseen things. No matter how hard Lothlane tried to close that veil, things slipped through. End quote. So he's hallucinating, or not exactly hallucinating, I guess, but seeing reflections of things that move in other worlds, his doors of perception open and impossible to close. We learn that his hatred of both elves and men stems from the fact that he is, in his words, a half-breed, a child of a human father and an elven mother, and if we are paying attention, we might well speculate as to which human male is his father, given how few of them live among the Westfolk. But really, it's the voice of darkness that has turned Lothlane into the manipulative, murderous monster we see before us. Voices which affirm his every worst impulse and belief, which praise him and agree that his insufficiencies are the results of plots against him, which rob him of self-awareness, that crucial virtue. And these voices of darkness are specifically targeting Rodri Melwaith. And last but not least, we get the arrival of Nevin to Rodri's encampment, his acknowledgement to Sligan that the Dwemer is real, and then he meets with Jill. Quote, "In spite of her dirty men's clothing, in spite of her face that was different than Brangwen's for all its beauty, Nevin recognized her immediately. His first muddled thought was a surprise that she would be so tall. Good morrow, Jill. Adeline's told me somewhat about you." "Has he now? Good things, I hope." "They were." End quote. The echo here of our Adeline, which is how Lyssa refers to the boy 350 years in the past when Nevin decides to take him on as an apprentice, is really lovely. And now more than ever, of course, Adeline is theirs, both of theirs, the spirit of the mother and the teacher, the guide. And that's not all, because Jill, in an echo of a scene that we've seen played out a few times already, seems to remember the old man. Quote, "For a moment, Nevin nearly wept. Even after all these years, she still remembered him." End quote. And that is going to do it for this, the second part of our discussion of Daggerspell. It has flown by so quickly. Next week, we're going to wrap it up. And then the following week, we are going to move on to something very different. The Patreon poll to choose the next book was a tie between Wuthering Heights and Great Expectations, but because support for the former seemed somewhat less enthusiastic than for the latter, we are going to begin Charles Dickens' 13th novel, Great Expectations, in 2 weeks' time. I will have it broken down into readings by next week's session, but I think 4 weeks should do it, though it is the longest book that we've covered so far, so it's possible that we will push to 5. Stay tuned for more information about that. Please do get in touch and let me know what you make of Daggerspell, how you're enjoying the reading, whether you've read the rest of the series, and certainly if you'd like to someday cover the second book in the series here on the podcast, I would be open to doing that if you guys are enthusiastic, albeit probably not soon. In any case, you can get in touch and let me know. starsandswordspod@gmail.com or starsandswordspod over on Instagram. And as ever, if you are so inclined, please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/nextword, which will get you access to all of the many bonus episodes, with a new bonus episode coming soon, and the Discord channel where the best and brightest hang out and chat, and also, I'm there, incidentally. If Patreon isn't your thing, or if you can't commit right now, then please do consider leaving a rating and a review wherever you happen to be listening to this podcast, particularly on Apple Podcasts. Every kind word helps. And that's it. That'll do us. Next week, the rest of the book. And until then, now listen, lads, Cullen said. No heroics like in the bard songs. Just fight to hold your place. Thanks for listening.